In the summer of 1943, on the sun-scorched island of Sicily, a general did something that no battlefield rulebook could justify and no commanding officer had sanctioned. And in doing so, he redirected the entire Allied campaign in the Mediterranean in ways that still echo across the history of the Second World War. General George S. Patton Jr. was supposed to protect a flank. He chose instead to seize a capital. What followed was not just a military controversy. It was a confrontation between the chaos of genius and the discipline of command that would be debated in the halls of power for years, all the way to a conversation between a former Supreme Allied commander named Dwight D. Eisenhower and the plain-spoken President of the United States, Harry S. Truman. That conversation, and what Truman said, cuts to the heart of what America does with men who win wars by breaking the rules. This is that story, told in full, with every fact accounted for and every consequence examined. If you've ever believed that history is shaped by the decisions of ordinary men in impossible moments, subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button so this story reaches more people, share it with anyone who loves the real truth behind the legends of World War II, and drop a comment below telling us something you didn't know about Patton before you clicked, because by the end of this video, that list is going to be very long. Operation Husky, launched on the night of July 9th into 10th, 1943, was the largest amphibious assault in the history of warfare to that point. More than 150,000 Allied ground troops came ashore on the southern shores of Sicily, covered by over 4,000 aircraft and more than 3,000 naval vessels. The plan, drawn up over months of intense Allied deliberation, assigned the principal offensive role to British General Bernard Montgomery and his veteran Eighth Army, who were tasked with driving northward up the eastern coast of the island toward Messina, the strategic port that controlled the passage to mainland Italy. General Patton and his American Seventh Army were given what amounted to a supporting role: protect Montgomery's left flank, secure supply lines, and advance cautiously into the western interior of the island. To Patton, a man who had spent his entire career studying Napoleon and Rommel, who had memorized Clausewitz on his honeymoon and trained his men with a ferocity that bordered on savagery, the assignment was an insult wrapped in military courtesy. He accepted it because he had no choice, but he never intended to honor its limitations for a single moment longer than the situation required. The early landings were violent and disorganized. A fierce storm in the days before the invasion had nearly canceled the entire operation, and the rough seas scattered paratroopers widely across the Sicilian countryside. The American 82nd Airborne Division suffered catastrophic losses, not only from enemy fire but from friendly anti-aircraft guns that, in the confusion and darkness, tore through their own transport aircraft. 36 British gliders went down into the sea, drowning 252 men of the 1st Air Landing Brigade. Only 12 gliders reached their designated objectives. On the beaches at Gela, where Patton's 7th Army came ashore, the situation quickly became critical. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division launched repeated armored counterattacks against the vulnerable beachheads, punching toward the sea with the intent to push the Americans back into the surf. Patton personally directed naval gunfire and artillery against these assaults, standing in exposed positions and directing fire with a fury that electrified his men and terrified German armor. By July 12, the Americans had secured the beachhead, but at a steep price, and Patton was already looking west, toward a city no one had told him to take. On July 16, Patton sent a request to British General Harold Alexander, who commanded the Allied ground forces in Sicily, asking permission to push troops toward the inland city of Agrigento. The request was granted. But Patton was thinking far beyond Agrigento. He was thinking about Palermo, the ancient capital of Sicily, the island's largest city and its most important port. No order existed authorizing a move on Palermo. In the Allied plan, Palermo was not even a near-term objective for the American forces. But Patton looked at the battlefield and made a calculation that every instinct, every year of study, every tactical intuition he possessed told him was correct. Montgomery's advance up the east coast was stalling against fierce German resistance along the Etna line. The western approaches to Sicily were thinly defended by demoralized Italian forces, and if the Americans moved fast enough, they could capture the island's capital before anyone had time to object. Forcing Alexander's directives, a polite way of saying he exceeded his authority, Patton directed General Jeffrey Keyes and the Provisional Corps westward and northward, toward Palermo, without explicit authorization from Allied command to do so. The march to Palermo was one of the most remarkable feats of rapid movement in the entire European theater of the Second World War. Patton's forces covered nearly 100 miles of rugged Sicilian terrain, through mountains, across ancient roads, in summer heat that wilted men and equipment alike, in under 2 weeks. The Italian troops they encountered surrendered in enormous numbers, sometimes in the thousands, raising white flags and laying down weapons before American columns that moved with a relentlessness the Italians had not anticipated and could not counter. On July 22, 1943, just 12 days after the initial landings, American forces entered Palermo. The fall of the Sicilian capital was not merely a military victory, it was a seismic psychological shock that reverberated all the way to Rome. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini's already fragile hold on power crumbled further. Within 2 days of Palermo's fall, on July 24, Italian military and government leaders voted to remove Mussolini from power. He was arrested that same day. The capture of a Sicilian city by a general acting outside his orders had helped trigger the political collapse of a fascist regime that had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades. Eisenhower's reaction was complex and revealing. He had not authorized the move on Palermo. When word reached him of what Patton had done, moving an entire corps across half an island without explicit orders, his immediate private response was fury. The Supreme Commander was responsible for maintaining coalition harmony, for ensuring that British and American forces operated within a coherent plan, and for presenting to the combined Chiefs of Staff in Washington and London a picture of Allied discipline and coordination. Patton's unauthorized dash made Eisenhower look, at minimum, like a commander who could not control his subordinates. At the same time, Eisenhower was a man of extraordinary strategic intelligence, and he could not deny what the facts on the ground were telling him. Patton's move had worked. Montgomery's Eighth Army, bogged down against the Etna line, was going nowhere. German General Albert Kesselring had concentrated his best forces on the eastern approach to Messina precisely because that was where the Allied plan said the main effort would be. Patton had found, and exploited, an opening that the original plan had not foreseen, and the results were reshaping the entire campaign. By July 23, Montgomery was forced to acknowledge that his own drive had stalled. The British commander, whose competitive pride was formidable, sent Patton a message from his headquarters. Congratulations on securing Palermo and clearing the western half of Sicily. It was gracious on the surface, and private condescension beneath it. Montgomery privately regarded the dash to Palermo as a flamboyant stunt, a publicity-seeking maneuver that had contributed little to the real objective of capturing Messina. But then, on the 25th of July, something extraordinary happened. Montgomery met Patton at Syracuse Airfield and made a proposal that would have seemed unthinkable weeks earlier. He offered Patton's 7th Army the use of both major northern roads on Sicily, Highways 113 and 120, for a combined drive on Messina. What had begun as an unauthorized sideshow had become, by the logic of events, the main Allied effort. Patton walked out of that meeting as the primary commander in the race for Messina, a position that the original Operation Husky plan had explicitly reserved for the British. He had stolen the starring role from Montgomery without a single written order authorizing him to do so. If this story has already surprised you, imagine what's still to come. Subscribe to this channel and like this video now, share it with a friend who loves military history, and tell us in the comments what aspect of Patton's boldness strikes you most. The race for Messina that followed became one of the most intense and bitter episodes of the Sicilian campaign. Patton drove his men with a merciless urgency, staging multiple amphibious end runs along the northern coast to leap past German defensive lines and cut off retreating Axis forces. He was everywhere, visiting frontline units, dressing down officers who moved too slowly, appearing at crossroads under fire to direct traffic himself, functioning less like an army commander and more like a force of nature given military rank. He organized 3 separate amphibious operations to outflank German positions, and his intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, was already detecting warning signs in German troop dispositions that would prove prescient when those same German commanders later built their positions on the Italian mainland. The Americans reached Messina on August 17, 1943, beating the British there by hours. A British officer congratulated Patton at the final ceremony with words that captured the absurdity and the grandeur of the entire episode. It was, he said, a jolly good race. Patton had won. And he had won by starting a race that no one had told him to run. But even as American forces accepted the surrender of Messina, a darker chapter was unfolding that would nearly destroy Patton's career in the middle of its greatest triumph. During 2 separate incidents in Sicilian field hospitals, on August 3 and August 10, 1943, Patton struck soldiers he accused of malingering. In the first incident, he slapped a private named Charles Kull across the face, called him a coward, and kicked him in the rear as he was leaving the ward. In the second, he struck Private Paul Bennett and pulled a pistol, threatening to shoot him for what Patton considered an act of moral failure in the face of combat. Both men were, in fact, suffering from genuine combat exhaustion, what would later be understood as post-traumatic stress. When Eisenhower learned of the incidents, his response was unequivocal in private even as it was strategic in public. He sent Patton a letter that military historians have described as containing some of the strongest words of censure ever written to a senior American officer in wartime. Eisenhower stated flatly that conduct of this kind would not be tolerated in his theater regardless of who the offender might be. He ordered Patton to make a public apology to the soldiers and to the units that had witnessed the incidents. And then he made a decision that would define his own character as much as it defined Patton's fate. Eisenhower chose to keep Patton. It was not a comfortable decision. Several senior officers and war correspondents were aware of what had happened, and the story, if it broke fully in the American press, could have ended not just Patton's command but Eisenhower's credibility as well. Eisenhower gathered the correspondents who knew of the incidents, explained what had happened and what actions had been taken, and asked them, not ordered them, asked them, to voluntarily decline to file the story. They agreed. Eisenhower's reasoning was direct and documented. Patton was, in his private assessment, the best ground-gaining commander the Allies had developed by that point in the war. To relieve him after Sicily would be to discard the one general whose aggression and tactical instinct had delivered everything the campaign required, and more besides. The story eventually broke anyway, in November 1943, when a radio reporter returning from the United States heard it and broadcast it over the air. Public outrage followed. Congressional pressure mounted. Eisenhower did not waver. He told his superiors that Patton was too valuable to lose and absorbed the political damage himself. It was an act of institutional loyalty, not to the man, but to the mission. What happened next to Patton contains one of history's most striking ironies. In early 1944, with the Normandy invasion being planned, Eisenhower assigned General Omar Bradley, who had served under Patton in North Africa and Sicily, to command the First Army for the D-Day landings. Patton was sidelined. He was publicly displayed as the commander of the fictional 1st United States Army Group, a phantom force of ghost divisions and fabricated signals traffic designed to convince German intelligence that the main Allied invasion would come not at Normandy but at the Pas-de-Calais. The deception operation, known as Fortitude South, was built in part around the Germans' own estimation of Patton as America's most dangerous general. Adolf Hitler himself was reportedly convinced that wherever Patton commanded was where the real blow would fall, and so Patton commanding a non-existent army kept real German panzer divisions pinned in place, far from the beaches of Normandy, on the morning of June 6, 1944. The man who had seized Sicily by ignoring his orders was now saving Normandy by not being there at all. His reputation had become a weapon more powerful than any armor he commanded. When Patton finally took command of the Third Army on August 1, 1944, the results were immediate and staggering. His armored columns burst out of the Normandy hedgerow country into the open terrain of northern France, and within 30 days they had captured Mayenne, Laval, Le Mans, Reims, and Chalons, an advance covering enormous distances at speeds that left German commanders struggling to comprehend what was happening to their lines. Then, in December 1944, the Germans launched their massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. Eisenhower ordered Patton to pivot his entire army 90 degrees, shift direction, and drive north to relieve the besieged American forces at Bastogne, Belgium. Patton did it in 3 days, a movement of multiple divisions through winter conditions that military planners had estimated would take at minimum a week. He had prepared contingency plans for exactly this scenario even before the German attack came, ordered by his intelligence officer Colonel Koch, who had predicted the offensive based on German troop dispositions. By December 26, 1944, the Third Army had broken through to Bastogne. It was, by any measure, one of the most audacious operational pivots in the history of warfare. In March 1945, Patton's forces reached the Rhine River. On March 1, they took the city of Trier, a city that Eisenhower's headquarters had instructed Patton to bypass, estimating it would require 4 divisions to capture. Patton's reply has become one of the most famous dispatches in military history. He had taken Trier with 2 divisions. What did Eisenhower want him to do? Give it back. By VE Day on May 8, 1945, the Third Army had been operational for 9 months and had liberated more than 80,000 square miles of territory, inflicting more than 10 times its own casualties on the enemy. It had fought from Brittany to Bohemia, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the ruins of a crumbling empire. But Patton's post-war life was brief and bitter. Assigned as military governor of Bavaria, he immediately proved incapable of the political restraint the role demanded. In September 1945, at a press conference, he was goaded into comparing the Nazi Party to the American Republican and Democratic parties. Eisenhower summoned him to Frankfurt and told him plainly that he had broken the back of Allied policy. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army and assigned to oversee the compilation of a historical record of the war in Europe, a fate that felt, to Patton, like a kind of living burial. On December 9, 1945, less than 3 months after being removed from command, Patton's car collided with an army truck on a road near Mannheim, Germany. He was taken to the hospital with a broken neck, a fracture and dislocation of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. He asked the attending neurosurgeon, Colonel R. Glenn Sperling, for the unvarnished truth, man to man. Sperling told him that the prognosis depended on what happened in the coming days. Eisenhower placed a personal aircraft at the disposal of Patton's wife Beatrice. Patton lingered for 12 days, telling his wife he felt fine while privately acknowledging to his doctors that he understood the gravity of his condition. On December 21, 1945, General George Smith Patton Jr. died of pulmonary edema and heart failure. He was 60 years old. Eisenhower did not attend the funeral, a decision governed by protocol but reflecting also the profound and permanent rupture that had formed between the two men in the final months of peace. Patton was buried not in the United States but in Luxembourg, at the American Military Cemetery at Ham, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army he had driven so mercilessly and loved so ferociously. He had said it himself, "It was foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died, rather we should thank God that such men lived." The conversation between Eisenhower and Truman about Patton did not take place in a single defined moment preserved in a single document, but it was reflected in the record they both left behind. Truman and Eisenhower shared a relationship of their own that would become bitterly strained after Eisenhower entered politics. Truman once called Eisenhower a fool for abandoning the values he associated with military service in pursuit of a political party, but on the matter of Patton they had a documented and shared understanding that cut across their personal animosities. Truman had met Patton at Potsdam in July 1945, where the Allied leaders gathered to negotiate the post-war order. Eisenhower, reflecting on Patton in his memoirs and in private correspondence, called him indispensable for the pursuit across France and praised what he described as extraordinary driving power, while also noting that Patton's behavior in peace was beyond what any democratic institution could tolerate. What Truman, that plain-spoken man from Missouri who had made the decision to use atomic weapons and who brooked no sentimentality about military greatness, what Truman reflected about Patton was essentially this. Here was a man who was irreplaceable in war and ungovernable in peace, a general whose unauthorized dash across Sicily had not merely changed one operation but had toppled a dictator, redrawn the Mediterranean campaign, saved Normandy through the power of his own reputation, and liberated more of Europe than perhaps any other American commander, and yet civilization, in the end, could not keep him. That paradox was Patton. And now that you know this story in its full and unbroken truth, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, like this video to push this history to more people who deserve to know it, share it with someone who believes that the greatest stories are the ones that actually happened, and leave a comment below telling us what part of this story you found most extraordinary, because the line between genius and insubordination, between victory and catastrophe, has never been drawn more dramatically than it was on that sun-scorched island in the summer of 1943, when a general ignored his orders and changed the world.